The auctioneer's voice cut through the cold November air like a blade. Do I hear $40? 40 for the widow woman. Comes with her own 2 hands and a strong back. No debts, no family. $40, gentlemen. Bridget Shea stood on the wooden platform outside the Calvary Creek land office and kept her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the heads of the men gathered below. She had learned in the 3 weeks since her father's creditors had arranged this, that if she looked at their faces she would start to shake. And she refused to shake. She was 23 years old, and she had buried a husband and a baby in the same September, and she had nothing left to prove to anyone about what she could endure. 45, someone called. She did not look to see who. The man who had organized this, Fenwick from the land office, round-faced and apologetic in the way only truly spineless men manage to be, had explained it to her as a contract arrangement, a labor placement. She would work as housekeeper and cook for a rancher north of Calvary Creek, in the foothills where the Alberta sky went on forever, and the winters came early and stayed long. Her father's debt would be cleared. She would receive room, board, and a small wage. It was not slavery, Fenwick had said, tugging at his collar. It was a practical arrangement for a practical time. Bridget had looked at him and said nothing. What was there to say? She had no money, no land, no family beyond a father who had drunk himself into ruin by the time the first snow fell. She had a worn wool coat, a carpet bag with a change of dress and her mother's Bible, and the kind of stubbornness that had kept the Shea women alive for 3 generations of hard winters. $50, a voice said. Different from the others, quieter. She looked then, despite herself. The man standing at the edge of the crowd was not what she expected. She had been bracing for someone old, someone leering, someone who looked at a woman on a platform and saw a solution to a problem they'd created themselves. This man looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days, and eyes that were looking at her with something that was not desire, not hunger, not cruelty, but something so tired it was almost worse. He looked like a man who had run out of choices and was buying the last one on offer. She understood that feeling completely. Fenwick cleared his throat. $50 from Mr. Calloway. Do I hear 55? Sold. His name was Reed Calloway, and he said exactly 4 words to her on the wagon ride north. Can you cook biscuits? Yes, Bridget said. That was the conversation. She sat beside him on the wagon bench with her carpet bag on her lap and watched the town fall away behind them. The road climbed through birch stands, gone bare and golden, past frozen creek crossings and stretches of open country where the wind came off the Rockies with nothing to slow it down. Reed Calloway drove with his eyes straight ahead and his hands easy on the reins, and she got the distinct impression he had forgotten she was there. She didn't mind. She was busy watching the land. It was not what she had expected from Alberta. She had grown up in Nova Scotia near the water, where the land was green and salt-bitten and small-feeling in the best possible way. This was enormous. The sky was the color of old pewter, and it went from one edge of the world to the other without interruption, and the foothills rolled beneath it like something sleeping. It should have felt threatening. Instead, it felt like a held breath. She was still thinking about that when the wagon crested a rise, and she saw the ranch. It sat in a shallow valley with a creek running along its eastern edge. She would learn later that the creek was called Horseshoe Creek, which struck her as exactly the kind of name a rancher would choose and a poet would never. There was a main house, 2 stories, built from logs, and then clad over in rough-cut board with a covered porch along the front, a barn larger than the house. 3 outbuildings she couldn't identify yet, fencing that stretched in every direction, and standing on the porch side by side were 2 children. They were perhaps 7 or 8, a boy and a girl, dressed in matching wool coats that were slightly too big for them. The girl had her father's dark eyes and a braid coming undone on one side. The boy was missing one of his front teeth. They watched the wagon come down the slope with an intensity that Bridget found startling. Not the casual curiosity of children watching a stranger arrive, but something more deliberate, more assessing. When the wagon stopped, the girl jumped off the porch before Bridget had even set down her bag. "Are you the one Papa brought to help?" she asked. Up close, her eyes were darker than her father's, almost black, watchful, older than 7 should produce. "I suppose I am," Bridget said. "I'm Nettie," the girl said. "That's my brother. His name is Amos, but he doesn't talk to strangers right away, so don't take it personal." Amos, still on the porch, raised one hand. Whether it was a wave or simply acknowledgement, Bridget couldn't tell. "I'm Bridget," she said. Nettie considered this. "That's a good name," she said finally, with the absolute authority of a child who has decided something. "Come on, I'll show you where the kitchen is." Papa never showed the last one, and she got lost looking for the root cellar, and that was a whole thing. Bridget looked back at Reed, who was unhitching the horse and had not so much as glanced in her direction. She followed Nettie inside. The house was cleaner than she'd expected and colder than it should have been. Someone had swept the floors but let the fire die down, and the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and something burnt. Porridge, she guessed, from the pot soaking in the dry sink. There were dishes stacked neatly enough, but the windowsills were dusty, and one of the curtain rods had come half loose from the wall and been left hanging at an angle. It was a house where someone had been trying and not quite managing. She found the wood box, found it low, and went to fill it before she even unpacked her bag. When she came back through the kitchen, Nettie was sitting at the table watching her with that same unnerving attention. "The last lady didn't last," Nettie said. "Neither did the one before that. How many have there been?" Nettie counted on her fingers. "3 since Mama died, 2 before you this year." Bridget set the wood beside the stove. "What happened to them?" Mrs. Poole said Papa was too difficult. Mrs. Travers didn't say anything. She just left one morning before breakfast. Nettie paused. "I don't think it was Papa, though. I think it was the quiet. People don't know what to do with that much quiet." Bridget looked at her. "And the quiet doesn't bother you?" "I grew up in it," Nettie said, as though this explained everything, and perhaps it did. Amos appeared in the doorway. He had apparently decided she was no longer a stranger, or at least had downgraded the threat level, because he came in and sat at the table beside his sister, and looked at Bridget with eyes that were lighter than his twins, gray-green, serious, framed by lashes any woman would have envied. "You don't look like you're going to leave," he said. It was the first thing she'd heard him say. His voice was low for a boy his age, careful. "I generally don't leave places I've just arrived at," Bridget said. Amos nodded slowly, as though this was a reasonable position that merited consideration. She lit the stove. The first week, Reed Calloway was a presence in the house the way a weather system is a presence. You were always aware of it, but you couldn't do much about it. He came in for meals, ate without comment, and went back out. He said good morning the way some men say grace, out of habit, without much behind it. He did not ask about her history or offer his own. He left his boots by the door and his coat on the hook, and otherwise gave her no trouble whatsoever. She cooked 3 meals a day, kept the fire, cleaned what needed cleaning, mended what needed mending. She figured out the root cellar on her own. It was behind the barn, which was a ridiculous place for it, but she supposed no one had asked her opinion. She figured out which of the outbuildings was the smokehouse, which was storage, and which one Reed seemed to disappear into for hours at a time. The latter turned out to be a workshop of some kind. She heard metal striking metal sometimes, late in the afternoons. Nettie helped her learn the house. Amos helped her learn the land. He would appear at her elbow when she went to the root cellar or the wood pile, and silently point out things she needed to know. Where the ice was thickest on the path, which fence post was loose, where the barn cat had hidden her kittens. He never said much, but he was never not there. By the end of the first week, she had learned the following things about Reed Calloway. He took his coffee without sugar, he was left-handed, he had a burn scar on the inside of his right forearm that was at least 10 years old. He slept badly. She could hear him moving in the room above hers before 5 most mornings, and he was better with those children than she had initially given him credit for. Not demonstrative. She never saw him hug them, never heard him call them any of the soft names parents sometimes use. But he checked on them. He left small things. A carved wooden horse on Amos's windowsill, a piece of ribbon he'd clearly picked up in town for Nettie, tucked under her plate at breakfast without ceremony. She tried not to notice these things. It was easier not to notice. Her own grief was a stone she carried in her chest. She had learned to move around it, to walk and work and speak without letting it shift, but it was always there. At night, when the house went quiet and she lay in the small bedroom off the kitchen, she let herself think about Thomas, her husband 26, taken by a fever before the harvest was in, and the baby who had not quite made it into the world properly. She did not think about them for long. She had learned the limit of how long was safe. Then she would hear Nettie cough in the room upstairs, or the creak of Reed's footsteps crossing to check on the children, and she would listen to the dark house breathe around her and think, this is not home, but it is something. That will do for now. The trouble came in the second week, the way trouble generally comes, without warning and at the worst possible moment. She had gone to town with the children. Reed had given her a small sum for provisions and indicated with minimal words and maximum silence that the children needed new stockings, and they were on their way back out of the dry goods store when a woman stepped out of the millinery next door and stopped directly in front of them. She was perhaps 50, well-dressed, with a face that wore disapproval the way other women wore jewelry, as decoration, as statement. "Mrs. Garfield," Nettie said, in a voice that somehow managed to be both polite and deeply cautious. "Antoinette." The woman's eyes moved to Bridget. "And who is this?" "She works for Papa," Amos said, before Nettie could answer. The woman, Garfield, which Bridget filed away, looked her over with the slow, particular attention of someone cataloging a piece of furniture and finding it wanting. "You're the one Calloway bought at the Fenwick arrangement," she said. It was not a question. "I'm the housekeeper," Bridget said pleasantly. "That's one word for it." Mrs. Garfield turned back to the children. "You tell your father he ought to think about appearances. This sort of thing," her gaze slid sideways, including Bridget in the sort of thing, without looking directly at her, "does not go unnoticed." Bridget smiled. "Thank you for your concern," she said. "Good afternoon." She put her hand on Amos's shoulder and steered them both toward the wagon. She could feel Mrs. Garfield's eyes on her back the entire way. In the wagon, Nettie sat very straight and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then she said things about Mama, too, after she died. I heard her at church. Bridget kept her eyes on the road. "People like that say things," she said. "It doesn't make the things true." "I know," Nettie said. She looked out at the foothills going copper and gray in the late afternoon light. "I just wanted you to know we don't think of you that way, like something bought." Bridget's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "I know," she said. She told Reed about the encounter that evening. She thought he should know, not because she needed him to defend her. She was perfectly capable of managing Mrs. Garfield on her own, but because it was his children's reputation in this town as much as his own, and he deserved to have the information. He listened. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, the way he often sat in the evenings when the children were in bed and the day was winding down. He had the quality, she had noticed, of being able to go completely still. It was not the stillness of someone not paying attention. It was the opposite. When she finished, he looked at his coffee cup for a moment. "Garfield's been looking for reasons since Eleanor died," he said. "She wanted the land, originally. Thought I'd sell." "Your wife's name was Eleanor?" "Yes." Bridget waited to see if he'd say more. He didn't. She had learned not to expect more. "The children handled it well," she said instead. "Nettie especially." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, something more like the effort it took not to show one. "Nettie handles most things well," he said. "Too well. She shouldn't have to." It was the most he had said to her at one time since she'd arrived. She recognized it for what it was. Not an opening, not an invitation, just a moment where the door had swung ajar without him meaning it to, and she let it close without comment. "Good night," she said, and went to bed. The first real crisis was the cattle. It was a Monday in late November, temperatures that felt like they were trying to prove something, and Reed had gone out at first light to check on the south pasture herd. He didn't come back by noon, didn't come back by 2. By 3, Bridget had put the children to work at the kitchen table with a reading lesson and put on her coat. She found him in the south pasture with 8 dead cattle, and 3 that were staggering, and his face the color of a man who had done the arithmetic and come up with a number that doesn't survive the winter. "What happened?" she asked. "Don't know yet." He was crouching beside one of the fallen animals, his hands in the animal's wool. "Might be poison. There's some bad weed that comes up in the melt pockets. Might be something in the water further up." She stood back and thought about it. Back home, her uncle had kept sheep. Not cattle, but livestock was livestock in some of the ways that mattered. "The ones still standing," she said. "Get them moved first. Separate pasture. Different water source. If it's something they've been eating or drinking, every minute matters." He looked up at her. "I know it's not my business," she said. He stood. "Can you ride?" "Yes." She helped him move the 3 remaining animals. It took 2 hours in cold that went right through her coat and into her bones, and she did not complain once about any of it. When it was done, she went back to the house and got the children's supper on before Reed came in at dark, looking hollowed out in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He sat at the table. She put a plate in front of him. 5 years, he said, without preamble. "It took me 5 years to get the herd to where it was." She sat down across from him. The children were already in bed. The kitchen smelled of bread and wood smoke, and something slightly singed that she'd sort out tomorrow. "Is it enough to get through the winter?" she asked. "What's left?" "Barely." He looked at his plate. "I was already—" He stopped. "Already what?" He set down his fork. This was a man, she had figured out by now, who did not talk about his difficulties. Not because he was proud, exactly, but because he had spent 3 years managing them alone, and had simply learned to carry them like you carry a load on your back. If you put it down, it becomes real. If you put it down, you have to look at it. "The mortgage on the North Quarter comes due in March," he said. "The herd was supposed to cover it." She let that sit. "And now?" "Now I don't know." She had not come here to fix this man's finances. She had come to cook his meals and keep his house, and in the 6 weeks since the Fenwick arrangement, she had kept herself carefully from caring about anything beyond the practical. But she sat in his kitchen with 8 dead cattle between them and the sound of his children sleeping upstairs, and she thought about Nettie's hand on her arm the afternoon she'd come home from town, the way she'd said, "We don't think of you that way." "There are things I can do," she said, "in the house. I've been thinking about what's being wasted. The preserving isn't done properly. You've got twice what you need in some categories and nothing in others. If we spend 2 weeks doing it correctly, we cut the household costs by a third through the winter. That's not the mortgage, but it's something." He looked at her. Just looked. "And I can write," she said. "I'm good with correspondence. If you need to negotiate with the bank, I can help you put together something that doesn't make it sound like a ranch in trouble." She paused. "Which it is. But banks prefer not to know that." He was quiet for so long she thought she had overstepped. Too much, too practical, too much presuming that her role here was more than cook and housekeeper. "Why?" he said finally. She thought about it honestly. "Because your children are asleep upstairs," she said, "and they've lost enough." He said nothing. But when he picked up his fork again, his hands were slightly less tense than they had been. Christmas came to the Callaway Ranch without fanfare and with a certain stubborn determination. It was Bridget's idea to cut the tree. She had found a good spruce stand to the east of the main pasture during one of her walks with Amos, and she proposed it one evening over supper as though it were purely practical. "The children should have a tree," she said. "It doesn't have to be large." Raid looked at her and then at his children. Nettie was already sitting straight with the particular energy of a child trying not to seem too excited. Amos had stopped eating. "All right," Reed said. They went on a Saturday afternoon, all 4 of them. Reed with the axe, Bridget with the old sled she'd found in the barn, and Nettie talking continuously about every tree they passed and its relative merits. Amos walked beside Bridget. He had a quality she had come to depend on, in some ways she couldn't quite name. He was simply present, without demand, a small steady anchor beside her when the cold and the distance and the enormity of everything might otherwise have pressed in too close. "Bridget," he said, somewhere in the spruce stand. "Yes?" He considered for a moment. "Are you going to stay?" She looked at him. He was watching her with those gray-green eyes, serious as a question deserves to be taken. She had not thought about it, not directly. She had thought about getting through the winter. She had thought about the provisions and the accounts and the correspondence with the bank that she and Reed had been working on in the evenings at the kitchen table, sitting across from each other with Reed's cramped handwriting and her cleaner letters and a kind of wordless coordination she had not expected. She had thought about all of it except this. "I don't know," she said honestly. Amos nodded. "Okay," he said. He seemed satisfied with this, which she supposed was the privilege of a child who has learned to accept things that don't have clean answers. They found the tree. Reed dropped it with 3 axe strokes, clean and efficient, and dragged it to the sled. Nettie immediately began instructing him on how to hold it so the branches wouldn't break. He let her instruct him, which was, Bridget was beginning to understand, its own kind of language with him. Agreement without words, compliance that was also kindness, showing up in the small ways because the large ways were sometimes too much to navigate. She pulled the sled home with Amos sitting on top of the tree like a ship's figurehead, perfectly solemn, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't name it. She wasn't ready to name it. The letter came in January. It was addressed to Reed from the bank in Calgary. She knew what it would say before he opened it. They had sent a good letter, she and Reed, careful and honest and practical, and she had thought the man on the other end of it might be reasonable. The letter he sent back was not unreasonable. It was simply firm. March, the full amount. Reed read it twice and set it on the table. He had not said much to her in the weeks since the cattle. Not less than usual. Usual was not much. But the silence had changed in some way she couldn't articulate, the way the temperature changes before snow, not measurable yet, but felt. "I can contact my uncle," she said. "He's in Nova Scotia, but he's not without resources. It would be a loan and it would come with conditions, but—" "No," Reed said. "Raid, no." He was not angry. He was the other thing, that particular, absolute version of clothes that she had run into twice before and had not found any way around. "I'm not borrowing money from your family to save mine. My family has very little to do with it, Bridge. Just her name. Just her name, flat and final as a door closing." She stood up from the table. "You are going to lose this land," she said, "because you're too proud to accept help from someone who's offering it freely." "I'm not proud. You are." She was not angry either. She was something steadier than angry, which was more useful. "You are deeply, stubbornly, quietly proud, and you have been since the day I arrived, and I have watched it serve you badly on 3 separate occasions." He looked at her. Something moved in his face. "My wife tried to get a loan," he said, "from her brother. He gave it to her, and then he held it over her head for 2 years, and she came home from every visit to him smaller than she'd left." and there was nothing I could do about it because the alternative was losing the land. He stopped. So that's what that is. The kitchen was very quiet. My uncle is not that kind of man, she said, more quietly. But I hear you. She sat back down. They looked at each other across the table with the lamp between them and the cold pressing against the windows. Is there another way? She asked. There might be one thing, he said. There's a buyer interested in the East Quarter, has been for a year. I didn't want to sell because he stopped again, and she understood without him saying it, because Eleanor had wanted to keep the land intact, the whole of it, the thing they had built together. It's land, Bridget said gently. She's not in the land. He looked at her sharply. I'm sorry, she said. That was. No, he said. No, it's. He put both hands flat on the table, breathed. You're not wrong. She did not say anything else. Sometimes saying nothing is the thing that lets another person hear what you've said. He wrote to the buyer the next morning. February turned the corner toward March and the cold eased by fractions, the way cold does in Alberta, grudgingly in small concessions, with the constant suggestion that it might come back. The East Quarter sold. It was not enough, quite, but nearly enough, and with what Bridget had managed to put by through the household reorganization, they were $200 clear of the mortgage, and Reed's face looked, for the first time since she'd arrived, like a man standing on solid ground instead of ice. She had been on the ranch 4 months by then. She had stopped thinking of it as a temporary arrangement several months ago, and had stopped admitting that to herself around Christmas. She was not ready to know what that meant. What she knew was this. She knew where the barn cat liked to sleep in cold weather. She knew that Amos had nightmares sometimes in February, and that the thing that helped was someone sitting quietly in the chair beside his bed until he settled. She knew that Reed made his best decisions in the mornings, and his worst ones in the evenings when he was tired, and that the best thing to do in the evenings was talk about practical things and leave the rest for daylight. She knew that he was teaching himself to ask for help in increments so small you almost couldn't see them. A glance instead of a refusal, a pause instead of an immediate no, and once, in early February, a simple, "What do you think?" that had cost him something, and that she had answered as though it were the most ordinary thing. She knew that she had stopped carrying the stone in her chest the same way. It was still there. It would always be there. But she had put it down, finally, and looked at it, and found that she could. The thaw came on a Friday. You could hear it in the creek. She was hanging washing in the weak March sun when Reed came up from the barn. He had been making some kind of repair for 3 days. She hadn't asked, he had not offered. He stopped at the fence and watched her for a moment, in that way he had of watching things without self-consciousness, as though he had simply forgotten to pretend he wasn't looking. The bank's been settled, he said. I know, you told me. Right. He turned his hat in his hands. She had never seen him do that before. There's the matter of your wage. You're owed from December through now. I know, and the Fenwick contract runs through April. She kept her hands on the washing. Yes, after April, he said. You'd be free to go if you wanted. She turned around. He was standing at the fence with his hat in his hands and the spring sun at his back and the look on his face that she had learned to translate by now. Not blank, never blank, but very carefully controlled. A man who had learned to keep his face from saying things before his mouth could say them properly. And if I didn't want to go, she said. He looked at her directly. I'd need to know what that would look like, he said. What you'd want out of it. Whether it would be something you were doing because you had nowhere else or because... He stopped. Because you wanted to stay here. He put his hat back on, looked at the fence post, specifically. Bridget turned back to the washing. She took a clothespin from her pocket and hung a sleeve. Let the quiet sit. Let it breathe. She had come to understand in 4 months that silence was not the same as absence with this man. It was the shape of things that hadn't been said yet. My husband died, she said. And the baby. I told you that, yes. For a long time I thought that was the end of the story. She pinned another sleeve. I'm starting to think it might not be. The creek was very loud in the thaw. The sun was thin and sharp, and the first mud of spring had turned the yard copper. Reed said, the children would be glad. I know they would, she said. What about you? Another long pause. She didn't mind it. I'd be glad, he said. Like it cost something. Like he'd decided paying the cost was worth it. She turned around again. He was still at the fence in the same place, and she looked at him across the winter-flattened grass of the yard and thought about the woman who had stood on that platform in November with her carpetbag and her stubbornness and no idea whatsoever what came next. All right then, she said. Amos appeared at the kitchen door. He leaned against the frame, watching the two of them with those serious gray-green eyes, and then, slowly, deliberately, he went back inside. She heard him say something to Nettie. She heard Nettie make a sound that was very specifically the sound of a child who has been told something she already knew. She turned back to the washing. Somewhere up the slope, a meadowlark tried out a few notes, cautious and preliminary, as though it wasn't yet sure winter was actually over. It was.